I'm here on Parliament Hill with Victor Boutros, co-author of a book entitled The Locust Effect. Victor is with the Justice Department in Washington, and this morning Cardis and International Justice Mission co-sponsored a breakfast with parliamentarians in Ottawa to talk about that book. Victor, give us a sense of how you got into IJM and a little bit in terms of the focus on dealing with justice systems around the world, in particular in terms of trafficking.
Yeah, so I was still a student at Harvard when I first was introduced to Gary, who had just started this small organization called IJM that had 2 employees. Gary was the legal department, and a guy named Bob was the investigations department. And I was really taken with this case-driven model of human rights advocacy, where you actually take cases of individual victims and begin to push them all the way through the public justice system in the developing world. And I thought that model had incredible promise and was really the new model for the 3rd generation of human rights that we were now entering. And so that actually drew me into a changing career path where I chose to go to law school as a result of that, and have been engaged in that work ever since.
The title of your book, The Locust Effect, for those unfamiliar, makes reference to the locust plague in the Midwest in the mid-19th century, where locusts came and basically destroyed everything, and people ended up dying, regardless of all of the efforts and helps. Give us a sense of why you chose that particular metaphor in terms of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, there's really 2 aspects to it. One is the way that locusts can just descend and in a matter of hours destroy all these really great efforts that have been in place. So back in the 1870s, the U.S. essentially had some development policies that would incentivize people to go out to the West. There were land grants, there were opportunities for subsidies, and there were smart programs that were set in place, and the farmers would literally bet the farm on the growth of a cash crop at the end of the season. And just in hours, locusts can come and take away years of really smart and hard development efforts. And so that was one aspect of it. The other thing was the way in which all these smart development efforts can do absolutely nothing to stop the violence. So not only do the locusts come in and just devour all the good that the development community has been trying to provide, but also all those traditional approaches to poverty do nothing to stop the violence. And that seemed to us a great visual picture of what's happening in the developing world, where the locus of predatory violence, just everyday criminal violence, swarm in and take away all the goods and services that the development community is trying to provide. And all those goods and services do nothing really to stop the locus of predatory violence.
In your talk this morning to MPs and senators, you talked about the fact of, in many countries in the world, the police and law enforcement are people you run away from because they're part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution. Help us a little bit understand in terms of the importance of institutions, and not just having good laws, but having institutions capable of enforcing those laws and seeing them have their desired result.
Yeah, it's this sort of amazing story of the modern human rights movement since the end of World War II, where during the first generation of the movement, the challenge was just to get agreement on human rights. How do we actually get people to agree what human rights are? And that was just a tremendous success. It issued in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a series of conventions and instruments that followed that. But then the challenge was, okay, we have these rights, but they're just out in the ether. How do we actually bring them to a place where they have teeth? And so there was this political movement during the 2nd generation of the human rights movement to enshrine these standards as domestic law. So now they become enforceable. The tragedy was that handed over the enforcement of these rights to public justice systems that were just utterly broken. And so, as we say in the book, the analogy that we use is it's a bit like having all these people who are dying from this disease, and now we've created the vaccine that can actually prevent them from dying, but all the vaccines are locked away in a warehouse, and none of the vaccines are actually getting into the bloodstream of the people who are dying without them. It doesn't take away anything from the value of vaccines that have been created. That's still a great innovation. But it does suggest this urgent priority of getting the vaccines out of the warehouse and into the bloodstream of the people who are dying without them. And that really is the challenge that the poor and developing world are facing today. It's not the absence of good laws. They get laws. What they don't get is what you and I get, which is law enforcement. And so it is these just sort of everyday constables and police and prosecutors and judges and defense lawyers that now become the key power actors that are entrusted with enforcing the laws that protect the poor from the plague of everyday violence.
Curtis is delighted to be able to partner with IJM and having you here in Ottawa today to raise awareness of this issue. And clearly raising awareness of this is an important part. But IJM does much more than talk about it. You actually partner with police and judiciary in various countries around the world. Give us the Coles Notes version of how IJM approaches this particular work.
Yeah, IJM sort of pioneered this collaborative casework model where they, as opposed to sort of a traditional human rights approach, which is more top-down, where you go in, you publish information about the abuse in the hope that that places negative pressure on the government that will then trickle down sort of as relief for the victims. IJM instead sort of works from the bottom up. They actually take individual cases, individual victims, and begin to push their case all the way through the public justice pipeline. And in that way, they win in one of two ways. Either they win because they, through their just tenacity, pushing through the system, they begin to make the system work, or they find the specific choke points in the system that are broken, and then they can begin to work on those themselves. But they collaborate with local law enforcement, and I should emphasize, all of IJM's advocates on the ground are indigenous, so they're people from their own country trying to enforce their own country's laws on behalf of their own country's poor. And through this collaborative casework model, they've seen the rescue now of some 15,000 individual victims and are beginning to see transformation of public justice systems where the systems themselves are beginning to work and reduce victimization on their own.
Great. Well, on behalf of Curtis and and those who follow us, thank you very much for the important work you do. When I think of IJM, I think of an organization that's an embodiment of the importance of institutions and the renewal of social architecture. This is an organization that's actually, quite apart from the important topic they're addressing, they're actually embodying, as an organization and institution, helping police force and judiciary do their job, and in that way lead to a prosperous society. So Victor, thank you very much.
Thanks, my pleasure.